Sushant. Acha. Center. ఎక్కడ ఉంది నాది ఇక్కడ ఉంది అంతే కదా ఆయన లేడా ఇక్కడ రెండు వస్తున్నాయి రెండు కాదు ఒకటి డిజైన్ ఇప్పుడు ఏం వినపడదు కదా రంగరాజన్ ఇక్కడ ఉంది
Good morning.
Oh, good morning. Good morning.
Oh, good. So,
is it on?
Yes.
I see. Okay. Okay. Now, what do we? I mean, are there questions to be taken, or is there? What is the mechanism? Is there a mechanism, or I have to speak for 1 hour? What is the?
Yeah, Shailajan.
Namaste, good morning. Ganesh here, sir. Professor Rangarajan.
No.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
Sir, we will have a Q&A. And
Right.
If it is okay, I mean, if you wish to lecture for an hour, then we can lecture, use the hour, and then take some Q&A, if it's okay with you. Or if you wish to contain it within an hour, then accordingly, maybe the lecture can be about some 50 minutes or so, and take questions for 10 minutes, if that's okay with you, sir.
Yeah. Okay. I will see as we go along.
Fine, sir. I think we'll play by the ear. That might be better.
Yeah, so therefore, you probably I will take about 50 minutes. I mean, I think that's
Great.
long enough. And then,
No problem.
Then we can.
We'll play by the ear, as you said. That might be a better idea. Yeah. So, yeah, we're just about a minute or two away, sir.
Right. Yeah, it's all right. We can wait.
Sir, your review of the book came out very well. Sir. Good morning, Professor Rangarajan. Your book review has come out very well in Business Standard. By Srinivas Raghavan.
Yes.
It's very good. You know, it's I admire your patience to write 70-page book.
Right.
It's a very, very difficult job, you see.
People are still saying why I have not written about my childhood and other things. So,
That is not only.
Yeah. Hello,
Okay.
Mahendra.
Yeah.
Sir, it's 11. We will start, Professor Rangarajan.
Yeah. Okay.
So, namaste and good morning to all the members in the audience, all the distinguished members, and all the special invitees. I'm L.S. Ganesh. I'm presently serving as the Vice Chancellor at IFHE Hyderabad. And we are indeed honored and fortunate to, perhaps even blessed to have the opportunity to listen to a lecture on inflation and its control by Professor Rangarajan. I believe that attempting to introduce Professor Rangarajan is like attempting to introduce the sun and the stars. I wouldn't dare to do that, but at the same time, I'm duty bound to give a few words to sort of reflect on the kind of great person we are the honor of listening to today. And Professor Rangarajan, as you know, was a professor at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, in India particularly, and has also worked abroad extensively. And also, he has been the governor of the state of Andhra Pradesh, as well as the governor of the Reserve Bank of India. So his depth of knowledge in the economy, I think, is perhaps has few parallels in our country. And I believe that he is a fantastic source of inspiration, as some of you would have heard Professor JMR telling him about the book review that has come. I mean, you can imagine somebody who is entering the 90s and writing a book of about 350 pages. Sir, God bless you, and I hope we'll have many, many, many more healthy, very productive years ahead for the benefit of all of us in India in particular and the world in general. Sir, please do commence your lecture now, sir. Thank you very much, Professor Rangarajan. And thanks to Professor Koti Reddy and all colleagues who have made this happen. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ganesh. As mentioned, I propose to speak to you this morning on inflation and its control. I shall initially talk a little bit about the theoretical underpinnings relating to inflation, and then proceed to talk about the behavior of inflation in India and the steps that have been taken to contain inflation. And then finally talk about what is happening in the world in general and what should be the program of action if inflation is to be brought under control. Inflation is defined as the continuous or persistent increase in the general price level. There are two elements in this. Inflation relates to the increase in price level. And I would like to underline also the word general price level. We are not talking about increase in the prices of select commodities. We are talking about the increase in the general price level. This distinction is very often forgotten, and I shall come back to it a little later. So what causes inflation? There are two broad theories relating to the factors leading to inflation. One is called the demand pull, and the other is called the cost push. The demand pull inflation refers to a phenomenon in which the aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply, and as a consequence, the general price level increases. The name is therefore the question is, what do we mean by aggregate demand? Aggregate supply is more easy to define. Aggregate demand essentially means the total demand for output for goods and services. Is it in real terms or is it in monetary terms? Generally speaking, we think as if it is in real terms. In fact, Keynes underlined the fact that inflation will happen only after the full employment level is reached. Because according to him, once the full employment level is reached, the output cannot increase. Therefore, if at that particular point, the aggregate demand increases, the consequence is inflation. In fact, for a long time, it was believed that inflation happens only after reaching the full employment level. That turned out to be incorrect in the 1970s and 80s. In fact, inflation existed with unemployment or even rising unemployment. In any case, I will come back to the point, but generally speaking, the demand pull inflation happens when aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply, and therefore when demand rises above supply, inflation happens. The cost push inflation is that when the prices of individual commodities, or for example, the general wage level increases, then it automatically leads to an increase in the cost of production. And because of the increase in the cost of production, prices rise, and that is the consequence is an increase in the general price level, and that is the phenomenon that people call as cost push. the question that we will address a little later is, can the cost push inflation exist without a demand pull inflation happening simultaneously? As I said, the demand pull inflation was the one that Keynes underlined and talked about. Before I go to deliberate a little bit on some of the problems that arise in defining aggregate demand, let me go to one other view on inflation, which is what is called the view of the structuralists. The structuralists argue that the major reason for inflation is that when one segment of the society wants to have a larger size of the cake than it has, and it is this competition which leads to an increase in the general price level. This was the explanation that used to be offered by Latin American economists in the 1970s and even in 1960s. So you have an explanation flowing from aggregate demand exceeding aggregate supply. You have an explanation that sudden increases in the prices of individual commodities or because of wage increase, there's a cost push inflation. Now there is another set of theories explaining inflation. That is what we used to call the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money essentially argued if money supply increases, then it leads to an increase in price level. Please remember, in both aggregate demand exceeding aggregate supply and a cost push inflation, not much is talked about money. But whereas the quantity theory of money says that if the quantity of money in circulation increases, as a consequence, price increases. The standard version of the quantity theory of money is MV is equal to PT, where M is the quantity of money, V is the velocity of circulation of money, is equal to P, price level, multiplied by T, the transactions. If we assume V and T to be constant, then an increase in M leads to an increase in P. In the strict version of the quantity theory of money, an increase in M leads to a proportionate increase in price level, which means that if the quantity of money increases by 20%, then the general price level also increases by 20%. There are two versions of quantity theory of money. This is what they used to call money on the wing. There is the other view, money sitting, which means that the same thing can be translated into saying that the amount of money which people want to hold is a fraction of the real income. Therefore, M, which is the real money balances, is equal to K times Y, small y, which is the real income. That is, people's propensity to hold cash is a fraction of the real income. Now, how does the inflation explanation comes in? Here, once again, like the quantity theory of money, if M suddenly increases, what happens? Since the real income has not increased, suddenly they have excess cash on their hand. And they want to get rid of the excess cash. And in this particular process, the price level increases. So you see several sets of or several kinds of explanations for inflation. You have the demand pull inflation, you have the cost push inflation, the structuralist definition of what happens, and then finally the quantity theory of money. Of course, not all people completely subscribe to the quantity theory of money. That a 10% increase in money will lead to a 10% increase in price level. That is because this assumes when M changes, the quantity of production, T, does not change. Is that true? When money changes, when money increases, does it have an impact on output or not? The pure quantity theory of money assumes it has no effect on output. That is what is called in the literature as neutrality of money. That is, money is neutral. It does not affect the real output. But this is not totally accepted. Because, as you know, the process of money creation is also the process of credit creation. How does money come into existence? Money comes into existence because, let's say, the central bank of the country provides loan or provides meets the borrowing requirements of the government. Then it comes into existence and then it goes circulating. And the first chapter in any textbook on money and banking will be to talk about multiple creation of credit and multiple creation of money. Therefore, one man's expenditure is another man's income. That's the basis. Therefore, actually the banking system lends, and in the process of lending, deposit is also created. That is why Milton Friedman said long time ago, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. When cost-push inflation is provided as the basis of inflation, it completely ignores the fact that it is a monetary phenomenon. So the real question that arises is that is inflation a monetary phenomenon or not? So when you define aggregate demand, do we define aggregate demand in real terms or do we define aggregate demand in monetary terms? So according to some people, that cost-push inflation is a myth. What really happens is, when there is a cost-push phenomenon, then what does a firm do? Let's say the wages go up. Then they go to the bank, say that my working capital requirements have increased. And when the bank gives him additional working capital because the raw material prices have increased or wages have increased, then this increase in the wages and the increase in the raw material prices has been accommodated by providing a larger amount of credit. Let me quote from Friedman. He says, it is true that the upward push in wages produced inflation, not because it was necessarily inflationary, but because it happened to be the mechanism which forced an increase in the stock of money. Therefore, this line of thought does not entirely agree with the fact that the cost-push inflation or cost-push by itself does not create inflation. Cost-push has to be accommodated. It is that accommodation which essentially results in inflation. Tobin said, who does not agree with Friedman at all in general, said in one place that inflation is neither demand pull nor cost push, rather it is both. In fact, he went on to explain this in his presidential address to the American Economic Association in 1971. And Tobin said, I quote from him, post-war experience destroyed the identification of full employment with the economy's inflation threshold. You remember I mentioned that Keynes said it's only at the full employment inflation happens. The profession, the press, and the public discovered the new inflation of the 1950s, inflation without the benefit of gap, labeled but scarcely illuminated by the term cost push. Subsequently, the view of the world suggested by the Phillips curve merged demand pull and cost push inflation and blurred the distinction between them. So please note what Tobin has said. The distinction between cost push and demand pull doesn't stay. In fact, the one leads to the other. I will come back to this theoretical basis while analyzing the present phenomenon. India's inflation in the recent period started after 2021. India adopted in 2016 the framework of inflation targeting. What does this framework say? The mandate agreed between RBI and the government was that RBI shall maintain price stability. And price stability was explained as maintaining the inflation rate at 4%, but with a latitude of plus or minus 2%. Therefore, the goal is to have 4% increase in prices as the goal, but it can fluctuate between 2% and 6%. So as we call it, the comfort zone is between 2% and 6%. But the goal is to maintain over the long run or over the short or the medium term a 4%. Now, there are some complications in the interpretation. I will come to it later. But in 2019-20, the average of months inflation was 4.8%. In fact, after the adoption of 2016 the inflation targeting framework, the price level was maintained. The inflation level ruled well below 6%. In 2019-20, the average inflation was 4.8%. In 2020-21, that is the COVID year, it was 6.2. In fact, from April 20 to November 20, it was more than 6%. That is outside the comfort zone. In 2021-22, it was 5.5%. We can say it is within the comfort zone. But in the last quarter, it was more than 6%. Come 2022-23, which is the current year, between April and October, which is virtually 9 months, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, 7 months, over 7 months, the inflation remained above 6% continuously, month after month. And the average was 7.1%, clearly way above the comfort zone. In November, for which the latest data are available, it has come down to 5.9%, a shade below the upper limit. What has been the stance of monetary policy? The stance of monetary policy during the COVID period was essentially to stimulate the economy. Because of the lockdown, the economy was in a bad shape, and therefore the stance of monetary policy was directed towards stimulating the economy. What does a central bank of a country do to stimulate the economy? They lower the rate of interest, and they make available more liquidity to the banking system so that they can lend more. Therefore, what happened was in February of 2019, the policy rate, which is called the repo rate, was 6.25%. By March 2020, that is virtually within a year, the repo rate was brought down to 4.54%, and by May, it came down to 4%. So the policy during the COVID period, so between 2019 and 2000 May, the attempt was essentially to bring down the repo rate, make available more liquidity, and thereby stimulate the economy. Then the situation turned. Inflation started rising. Therefore, the Reserve Bank of India, like many other central banks, started raising the policy rate to control inflation. So from 4% in 22/5/2020, as of the recent period, 7/12/2022, it was raised to 6.25%. Therefore, it is essentially 2%, 2.25% increase, the 225 basis point increase in the repo rate. So the position is very clear. We had a COVID period during which the economy was facing a downturn, and therefore to stimulate the economy, the policy of the Reserve Bank of India was to stimulate it. It was done through several mechanisms, and the most important of which to lower the policy rate. But since then, after the 22/5/2020, the first step was taken on 2022. The policy rate was started rising. So we should say perhaps that the attempt has been to raise the policy rate in order to control inflation. Now, as you know, how this mechanism works is also a matter of dispute. As the policy rate increases, what happens? As the policy rate increases, all the other interest rates in the system also increase, and consequently, there is a tightening of credit. This leads to a fall in the general price level. This is a theory behind why the policy rate is increased in order to contain inflation. There is always a dispute in terms of monetary policy, when to tighten and how much to tighten. These are issues that come up all the time. But the fact is that the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, followed the policy of expanding credit, expanding liquidity when the economy was in the downturn, and tried to tighten when inflation started rising. Now, the whole question is, the importance of the question is that very often, even policymakers make the point that the inflation that we have seen is because of the sudden rise in the price of petroleum products after the Russia-Ukraine war. This is only a partial explanation. As I mentioned earlier, that is why I went into the theoretical issue at some length. As I mentioned, that when the prices of petroleum products rise, true, the prices of those commodities increase. But it does not necessarily mean the general price level will increase. The distinction between what happens to the individual prices and what happens to the general price level is of critical importance. I think we need to note that very clearly. Because let me give you an analogy. Look at a household. Let us say the household has a fixed income. And that income, let us say, does not increase. And imagine a situation in which the price of one commodity increases. How will the household react? Let us say that the price, the product whose price has gone up is very vital. Let's say petroleum product or food prices. If the income level remains constant, then what happens is less of the income is available for buying other products. And therefore, the demand for the other products will fall. Therefore, while the particular commodity which triggered the increase in prices may get away with it, but the prices of other commodities need not necessarily increase because less income is available and less demand is there. Therefore, unless there is a step that is taken in order to raise the income of the person, let's say there is a DA adjusted totally to price increases. Then when the price increases of one commodity and an adjustment is made in the income by providing an allowance, additional allowance, then you get a situation in which you have the general price level increasing. So what is really needed is the accommodation which Milton Friedman talked about. Therefore, I do not accept the fact, or I do not accept the contention just because the prices of commodities, certain commodities, maybe even food prices, because in some other countries, for example, the inability to import wheat from Ukraine resulted in the food prices going up. But what happens in the real system is, what happens in any system is that there is always an accommodation. And it is this accommodation of providing a larger allowance or providing the increase in income to people through additional subsidies or something like that. It is because of that the actual inflation increases. Therefore, this point has to be noted. Therefore, the explanation cannot be simply in terms of what has happened another complication that has also come in the recent period. And that is what? That is the fall in the value of the money, the implication on the exchange rate. In November 22, in April 2022, the value of the dollar was equal to 76.16 rupees. It went up to 82.34 in October. It came down to 81.81. But today it is reeling. It is around 82.8 rupees per dollar. This phenomenon has happened, and is there a conflict between dealing with this problem and dealing with inflation? The question is, what led to the increase increase in the value of the dollar in relation to rupee, or decrease in the value of the value of the rupee? The point is, in an earlier period, the value of the currency, the external value of the currency, was largely determined by the current account deficit. If the current account deficit is higher, the value of the rupee fell. And if the current account deficit fell, then the value of the rupee or the domestic currency also went up. But it is no longer true because of the capital transactions. Because what happens when there is a current account deficit, there is a greater demand for foreign exchange. But if there are capital transactions, like money flowing into the country, because people are wanting to invest in Indian shares or want to put it in the form of direct investment, foreign money, that is dollar, comes in, and therefore, in spite of the current account deficit, the rupee, its value does not fall because of the capital inflows. What has happened now is the inflation level in United States increased also. And therefore, to control that, they raise the rate of interest to a high level. And therefore, investors in the United States found it more advantageous to invest in US itself rather than send the money to India, or even to the extent of selling the shares they were holding in India and taking back the money to the United States. Therefore, it is a capital flow movement. Earlier, the value of the rupee was maintained because of the inflow of capital. Now the value of the rupee started falling because of the outflow of capital. And it is this outflow that resulted in what is happening. In some sense, in my view, that what is required to control inflation and what is required to control the depreciation in the value of the rupee is the same, which is to raise the rate of interest. Therefore, there are occasions in which what the country has to do in terms of maintaining the value of the currency and what it has to do in order to control inflation may be moving in the opposite direction. But that is not true now. Now it is in the same direction. But why is it still falling? Because the rate at which we are applying the control mechanism is less strong than what the United States is doing. The United States went to the extent of reducing it by almost 75 basis points a few times. I will come back to that a little later. But the point is that the direction in which monetary policy has to work is the same. But what the quantum of that is a matter of dispute. Let us see one phenomenon that we are seeing. Inflation today is worldwide. The US inflation in 2020 was 1.2%. In the United States, inflation beyond 2% is regarded as very high inflation. But what happened? What happened was that in January of 2022, inflation touched 7.5%. In June, it touched 9.1%. In October, it went to 7.7%. This is unheard of in the United States. This rise in inflation, this kind of a magnitude of inflation has not been seen in the United States for several decades. Look at UK. In January 2022, the inflation was 5.5%. In October of 2022, that is a few months ago, it was 11.1%. These numbers indicate a level of inflation in these countries beyond the normal situation to which they are accustomed. Of course, our inflation also increased, but you will see we normally tolerated a much higher level of inflation than what US and UK used to do. Then, one question that we can ask is, if the inflation is high in UK, it's high in US, it's high in India, it is high in many other countries in the world, is there some common factor that is doing it? Is there a common explanation for the rise in inflation? Let us go back to COVID-19 again. During the time of COVID-19, what did all countries do? Every country was advised to raise the government expenditure. This is a standard Keynesian prescription. When the economy is operating at a low key, operating at a low level, the idea is that we must really, the government expenditure must increase in order to stimulate the economy. This is what all countries did. Let me give you some numbers. In the United States, in 2019, the fiscal deficit was 4.67% of the GDP. Believe it or not, in 2020, the fiscal deficit of United States as a percentage of GDP was 14.81%. In 2021, it was 12.17. As you know, that in the United States, in order to stimulate the economy, they almost sent a check to every household in the United States in order to increase aggregate demand. Therefore, the enormous increase in government expenditure, consequent upon the high, and which resulted in the high fiscal deficit, is almost similar to what textbooks used to talk about helicopter money. Whenever they want to explain quantity theory of money, they would say that supposing there is a helicopter and it drops money all over the place, then everybody has more money in their hands, then what do? As I said earlier, on the Cambridge equation model, the amount of cash holding increases above what they would normally like to have. They spend it, and as a result of it, the price level goes up so long as output does not increase. Let me come to UK. In 2019, the fiscal deficit of UK was 2.2%. In 2020, it was 12.8%. And in 2021, it is 8.1% of GDP. In India, in 2012, it was 7.22%. This is taking both the center and the states. It went up to 13.31%. And in 2021, it is 9.62. The point that I'm making is that in order to meet the COVID crisis, all governments decided to increase the government expenditure. Since this increase in the government expenditure resulted in such a high fiscal deficit, which could be accommodated only by an expansionary policy on the part of the central bank. It is this which is coming home to roost. It is because of this we get into a situation in which the general price level has increased in all the countries. Let me make the point, because many people think it is the Russian-Ukraine war, which is the cause of inflation. Individual prices or increases in individual prices can act as trigger of inflation. But if inflation is to be sustained, there has to be an adjustment of the macro variable. And without that adjustment of the macro variable, it will not be possible for the inflation to be sustained. Let me give you some numbers as far as India is concerned. The expansion in liquidity is reflected in the increase in the reserve money. In April 21, year-on-year increase in the reserve money was 18.74%. And it kept on like that. And in October 21, it was 14.74 or 14.15. In February 22, it was 13.88. You can see some decline from the very high level. And as of a recent period, October 22, it was 11.22. Therefore, what has happened is, in a situation in which the output was not increasing fast, the increase in the reserve money and consequently the increase in money supply, which is somewhat moderate because the credit multiplier was not operating in the same way. The expansion in the reserve money led to what might be called the increase in general price level and inflation. The Fed chairman said, not yesterday, not at the time of the change yesterday, but the time before that, he said very categorically, the overarching focus, I'm quoting, the overarching focus right now is to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal. He added, the first lesson is that central banks can and should take responsibility for delivering low and stable inflation. So that is the policy that they have adopted. Now, we also have adopted a similar policy in the sense that, as I mentioned earlier, the policy rate has been raised, but it has not been raised as fast a rate at which the US and UK are doing. In fact, one question that arises is, what does this really mean in the context of inflation targeting as a framework? In inflation targeting, countries like India, the dilemma should be less. After all, the upper limit of the band provides the basis for action. Once the upper limit is crossed, the primary goal should be clear. Action must be directed first to bring inflation below the upper limit. In fact, the choice between control of inflation and safeguarding growth is not that clear. Inflation hits the poor even more than other sections of the society. In fact, the problem with inflation is its differential impact. Because in this particular context, one question needs to be asked. Why is inflation bad? So far, when I've been talking about it, I implied as if that inflation is bad and therefore inflation should be brought under control. Is inflation bad? Inflation is bad because Keynes wrote long time ago in the Tract on Monetary Reform on the impact of inflation. The most important thing is inflation does not affect all people in the same way. It is a differential impact of inflation that makes it a burden. For example, in India, the unorganized sector, people working in the unorganized sector are affected much more than the people working in certain other sectors where the increase in the price level is compensated through the provision of DNS allowance or some other or through some other mechanism. The rentier, as Keynes called them, also suffer. That is, the savers, for example, suffer. At a time when the price level goes up and when the interest rate is not going up at that level, then they lose. In fact, in the whole thing, in the recent period, the segment of the society which has been affected much was the savers, because the interest rate offered by the commercial banks was lower than the inflation rate. Even today, it is not as high as the inflation rate. Therefore, in real terms, the interest rate was negative. So different segments are affected differentially. And that is why inflation is bad. And of course, the other reason is it is only in an environment of price stability, savings increase, and investment also, investment in productive areas increases. Only when price stability is there. When price stability is not there, then those who want to invest become speculators. They put it in land, real estate, or gold. This is what happens when inflation rises. Inflation has started showing some decline. I hope it continues. It is right now, it is only a shade lower than the upper limit. We cannot afford to keep inflation at this level. It has to come down. What is really needed is a roadmap. The roadmap to get to 4%. This cannot be immediate, and that can also be very disruptive. But what is really needed is a glide path, so to say, as to when we will be able to get back to the 4% level, which is considered to be the desirable or the acceptable level of inflation. I think that is what is needed. And in this process, I believe that the government also must cooperate, in the sense that the fiscal deficit also needs to be brought down. So the point really is, to sum up, the inflation that you have been seeing in during the course of the last 1 year is partly triggered by individual prices, but it has been sustained because of the increase in liquidity. Therefore, if inflation is to be controlled, it must the authorities need to act on liquidity. That is the broad conclusion to which we come. But as I said, any sharp action can be highly disruptive of the economy. And therefore, we need to have a time frame over which the inflation level can be brought down to the acceptable level or the mandate given under the inflation targeting mechanism of 4%. That is the direction in which we have to move. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rangarajan. I have requested our audience members to chat and pose questions. I have 3 in front of me. The first is by Dr. Vivek Gupta. Sir, my question is that the recent inflation in India is due to supply shock and leftward shift of the AS curve. How do you think that the rise in interest rates will help augment the supply situation, and what would be the mechanism?
I think I spent most of my time to say that it is simply not caused by supply shock. The supply shock led to the increase in the price of petroleum products, let us say. But how does the general price level increase? The general price level increases only because of an accommodative stance that policymakers adopt. In some sense, it is inevitable. I mean, I'm not saying that there could have been another alternative. During the COVID period, when output was not increasing. Please remember, in the 2 years, 2021 and 21-22, what has happened is 1 year there was a drop in output. The next year was a compensation. Therefore, we are at the beginning of this 22-23. We were what we were at the end of at March 2020. Now, during this period, output has not increased, but money supply has increased. Therefore, it is wrong to think that it is only because of supply shock. Supply shock happened, it triggered. But it is also because of the sustained increase in liquidity in the system. Please remember the number of measures that were taken during the COVID period in order to increase liquidity. Therefore, without controlling liquidity, you will not be able to control inflation. It is as normalcy comes back, supply will increase. But during the period of, let us see, 22-23 is not the year in which the output has fallen. We are all talking about 22-23 in which the output will increase in the range of 6.8% to 7%. And therefore, what is really needed now, if you want to control inflation, is to reduce the liquidity, moderate the liquidity. Now, USA has taken the view, controlling the inflation is important. Even if you have to go through a little bit of recession, we will go through it. That's a clear policy direction that they have taken. We don't want that. We want the output to increase, but I believe the output increase will happen as we take moderate measures to control liquidity. And let us also think about very clearly, output increase is not going to be that severely affected because of the increase in interest rate. I believe it will have some effect, some impact, but output is a result of a number of things, of which the interest rate is one. Therefore, in some sense, moderation of liquidity is important, but at the same time, I'm thinking that moderation of liquidity will make people invest in proper areas. The speculative investment will go away and proper investment will happen. Yeah. What is the next question?
I think he's on mute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The second question is by Khalid ul Islam, who asks, is oil the same as any other commodity in terms of adjustments, as oil forms the input cost for most other industries?
Yes. What is it? I don't see the question.
The question is oil to be treated as any other commodity in terms of adjustments?
No, I think is the attempt is to moderate the increases of prices of certain commodities because they are what we call universal intermediates. The word universal intermediates means that it is used as an input in the large segments of the economy. Therefore, like for example, food prices. When I say action should be taken, it should not be only on liquidity. Action may be taken with respect to some individual commodities where the impact can be very severe, like food prices. I mean, I think we really have to do it. And to some extent on oil prices. But oil prices cannot be contained to a level where it was before the situation. Some increase in oil prices must also lead to a fall in consumption. I really feel that people should respond to increase in prices in the proper way. That if oil prices are going up, people must be willing to cut some part of their journey outside, which is not totally relevant. Yes, going to office, coming back from office, and certain other actions, activities are needed. But we should not, in a situation in which oil prices have gone up, that we absorb every increase in the price by the government. I think to some extent it can be done, but not to but not beyond that. Therefore, my point is that some adjustment can be done, but without acting upon liquidity, you cannot expect the general price level to go down.
Thank you, sir. Here is a question from a colleague, I think Professor Anirudh Prakya. I had suggested to the Reserve Bank of India Committee on ARCs in the months of April 21 and May 21 a few points, one of which included, within quotes, expand the RBI's preamble to regulate cash deposits with bank branches without bank notes, stroke coins, stroke checks, stroke drafts, and allow bank branches to accept cash to bank accounts by writing the available denominations on deposit slips without a requirement for bank notes or coins or checks or drafts, and by submitting PAN card or GST number or source of funds, the details required for tax deduction. Sir, could you please share your views on this?
I don't know what the objective of this is. I mean, I think this is not very clear. And
Anirudh, you are there. Would you like to open up, Anirudh, to clarify? Maybe
yes, thank you,
it
sir.
might be better since I can see you. Please directly pose the point, Anirudh. Your question, please.
Yes,
briefly.
thank you, Professor Ganesh, for giving me this opportunity to speak with Dr. Rangarajan himself. Sir, the objective was on asset restructuring. RBI had asked for a few suggestions from everyone. So I had written many points from the textbook also, which I thought maybe those would be reviewed by RBI. But one of the points which I felt and which you were also discussing from a Keynes point of view was maybe we need to increase jobs. This way, this would directly affect the inflation or deflation also. So it can be controlled by controlling the amount of money somebody can deposit without having to depend only on the secured printed notes that we use, right? So one of the points was this would be a type of job creation for maybe shopkeepers or many MSMEs also who don't generate the amount of revenue they expect.
I don't see it. How does it create job? You are saying that you are putting this money in the form of deposits.
Right. My objective is not from a structure point of view of considering it as a salary, but considering that most shopkeepers within India don't earn revenue the way they expect. So if a stable income is given, which doesn't depend only on the sales for type of revenue, like allowing them to directly write in the bank branches, then the amount of loans that are circulated may come down, and this may also control the inflation. So banks don't have to give more loans only, but they can also increase their operations, branch operations, by allowing this. That was the idea with which it was given.
If you want to control inflation, the central bank can actually raise the CRR, and if you raise the CRR, then also their ability to expand credit gets limited. Right? I mean, a higher percentage of deposits will have to be kept with the Reserve Bank, and therefore less of the deposits will be available to the bank for the purpose of lending credit. So that can be done through that if controlling the expansion of credit is what is required. So otherwise, I think the point really is that you cannot reduce the characteristic of money. The characteristic of money is that it is generally acceptable. And if you start doing anything with undermining that, then it loses its acceptability or credibility as money. So I need to look at it a little more carefully. I mean, if you send me that, I will respond to you.
Sure. Can I send you all the recommendations which I've made to the?
Yeah, sure.
Don't send me all the recommendations.
I think there is a separate channel by which we can reach out intellectually to Professor Rangarajan. Thank you, Anirudh. Thank you.
Thank you,
Sir.
sir.
There is a question from students and also from a colleague, Professor Padmavati. A sort of, you can take them on the track. The question from the students of Section K is, sir, what is the possibility of recession in India in 2023, or perhaps even global recession in 2023? Ankit Goti, that's the name. And Professor Padmavati's question is, sir, how far is the parallel economy with black money a conspicuous consumption? How far is it responsible for an increase in inflation in our country? So one on recession possibility and the other on the link between black money and conspicuous consumption and the link with inflation.
No, on inflation, or you added something to after inflation? What is it?
No, the first one was,
no,
what is the possibility of recession in 2023?
No, that's all right.
Okay.
Second one is saying the parallel economy.
Yeah, parallel economy and black money plus conspicuous consumption and their effects, I mean, as being responsible for increase in inflation in India.
Okay, inflation in India. I didn't hear that. That's all right.
Correct.
No, I think the point is we must understand what we mean by recession. Recession is a phenomenon where there is a decline in output. That is recession. And there is a definition in terms of how many quarters the decline in output happens. Therefore, that kind of a recession will not happen in India. We have resumed, the economy has started growing. What will happen, what we very often talk about is the decline in the growth rate of the economy. All right, this year, now most analysts are agreed, the rate of inflation will be, the rate of growth will be between 6.8% and 7%. Okay. Now, what will be the rate of growth of the economy next year? It depends upon a number of factors, including rainfall in the which will affect agricultural production. This also depends upon what is happening globally. If the global system has a recession, that is, the advanced economies have a recession, then it will affect our exports, and that may affect the rate of growth of the economy. But India is a big country, a large country. While the global situation may particularly affect our export activity, we are still big enough to be have a large aggregate demand. Therefore, the likelihood of the rate of growth of the economy next year, in my opinion, will be about between 6 and 6.5. It will be lower than this year, because this year, performance of the economy was on a low base. Next year, the economy will be growing on a base which has been reasonably good. That is, this year, the rate of growth is 6.8%. People keep on talking that this is the highest rate of growth of a large economy in this year. But people do tend to forget that this is a rate of growth over a low base. Therefore, my feeling is that the rate of growth of the economy next year is probably around 6%. Likelihood is more about 6%, so that will be the situation. even if there is recession in the rest of the world. Now, the second question is about the parallel economy and inflation. Now, let us see that I would like to say that when we talk about inflation now, we need to understand the situation as it exists now. Now, this parallel economy problem has existed all along. Therefore, there is nothing that is happening now which is aggravating that problem. The parallel economy has not grown during the COVID period or in the recovery period any more than what it normally does. Therefore, the impact of the parallel economy is not going to be any different this year than in any other year. Therefore, for the high level of inflation that we are now seeing, we have to look at other reasons. The existence of a parallel economy has some effect on inflation, but that remains the same this year as in the previous years. Therefore, any increase in inflation in the current year or in the coming year will have to be traced to factors other than the parallel economy. And that is what I was trying to explain in terms of the expansion in liquidity, expansion in terms of the prices of individual commodities.
Thank you, Professor. There are several questions, but in the interest of time, I'll close with Professor JMR's questions. Sir, excellent lecture. Thank you very much. While analyzing inflation policies, to what extent should we distinguish between core inflation and general inflation? That's A. And question number B is, are there changes in policies adopted by the government of India in controlling inflation over the last 2 or 3 decades? Basically, are there any fundamental changes that have happened over the last 2-3 decades? So those are Professor JMR's 2 questions. Okay. For the rest of the audience, we'll please take the questions parallelly across another channel in the interest of time.
No, the point about core inflation and general inflation is whether the impact of inflation in the core areas has more to do with the production of commodities in that area. Because what we are talking of core inflation is inflation other than what has happened to food and oil, I mean the energy prices. Therefore, the inflation essentially refers to the industrial commodities and so on. And therefore, one is looking at core inflation to find out whether there is disconnect between the general price level and the core inflation. But I believe that from a common man's point of view, the excluding food inflation and excluding inflation on oil prices doesn't make any sense. I mean, I think you have to pay a higher price for transport. And if food prices are going up, the food budget increases. Therefore, we should really look at general price level. But as I said earlier, sometimes action on some specific areas may be needed because inflation in that particular area affects the people more, like food prices. We really need to act because that affects the poorer people more than even than the other people. Similarly, since the increase in the oil prices affect all people who are traveling, and almost all people travel, and therefore action is required. But people look at core inflation only to understand whether industrial growth will be affected because of core inflation. And therefore it is good to see whether the core inflation also comes down along with other with the general price level, because taking some action on with respect to food or oil may bring down the inflation in those two areas. But if the core inflation is high, because if the general price level continues to remain high, then that means the core inflation remains high. And that has or that may have an effect upon the investment, that may have an effect upon the production of industrial commodities. To come back to what is the second one? I thought first one I noted core inflation and general inflation. And what is the second, I think, question? Or these are the two. Yeah, Mahendra, is there any question that you asked other than this? Hello?
So there are two questions.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yeah. You're audible, sir. You're audible.
So the second question is over time. Particularly, I have in mind during your time the method of monetary policy or control of inflation.
Right.
And
Okay.
the present position. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
No, I think there is the 2016 arrangement of inflation targeting is an important departure in terms of providing clarity to monetary policy. We have always talked about growth is an objective of monetary policy. Price stability is an objective of monetary policy. But the objective of price stability needed clarification. What does price stability mean? Whether inflation should be low, and if low, what it is. That is why we adopted this, by adopting this inflation targeting mechanism, which I would prefer to call flexible inflation targeting, because it does not say that the RBI should hold it at 4%. Some liberty has been given to the monetary authority to let the inflation go even above 4%, but they set a limit on it to 6%, because in a country like India, where supply shocks come too often, then to hold any authority to one fixed number is not good. Therefore, greater freedom has been given to the monetary authority. Therefore, there is a level of inflation which is considered to be acceptable over a medium-term period, and flexibility has been given to deviate from it up to a particular point. The question that really arises is, what happens when you go beyond the upper limit? I take a strong view on that. That once this mandate is given, then beyond the upper limit, it is quite clearly the role of the monetary authority to bring inflation down to that particular point. Therefore, I have been arguing that the first objective now should be to get the inflation within the comfort zone. We need not necessarily go to 4% today. That is impossible, and that, as I said, is disruptive. So basically, first we should get it to within the comfort zone, and then, as I indicated towards the end, indicate a glide path over which, or the time frame over which, we will come to 4%. I believe that the 2016 decision to adopt a flexible inflation targeting framework for India is an important step towards maintaining price stability.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Professor Kotireddy, could you please deliver the vote of thanks? Professor TKR, I think you're there. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone present here. On behalf of the Department of Economics at IBS Hyderabad, I extend my gratitude to our Honorable Chancellor, Dr. C Rangarajan, for taking time out from his busy schedule to deliver a special lecture on inflation and its price control. Thank you, sir, for an enlightening presentation, and we enjoyed every minute of your lecture. We are thankful to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor L.S. Ganesh, the Senior Advisor of IFHE, Professor J. Mahendra Reddy, the Dean, Dr. C.S. Shailajan. I'd like to thank the department faculty for their enthusiastic support. Due thanks to go to administrative staff of IBS Hyderabad for their administrative and logistic support. Media support is also acknowledged. Once again, I thank one and all present here. Thank you.
Okay. Ganesh?
Thank you, Professor Rangarajan. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay.
Season's greetings for you in advance.
Okay, all right. I think anyway, we will be meeting on.
Sure, sir. Sure.
Right.
Thank you.
So it's over. I'm planning to come on 21st of the evening or 22nd.
Great.
So,
Yeah.
one day earlier or not.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So we can log off and thank you very much,
Okay.
everybody.
Yeah.